sinful flesh and to deal with sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, so that the just requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And so what that basically is saying is that God decided that he would do things a different way. Okay, so so the law didn't work because of human corruption, human tendencies to sin and weakness. So what God would do is he would set up a different set of rules wherein Jesus plays a major role. Jesus comes to deal with sin, and by his death on the cross, condemns sin, okay, so that the requirements of the law could be fulfilled by people like you and myself when and if we live according to the Spirit. In other words, the law of the Spirit is the new way in which God would bring us to him so that we can love God and love neighbor. That's the law of the Spirit. A new way, a new order of things. And so the thing that we have to do is decide which set of rules are we going to live by? Which set of standards are we going to lift up? Are we going to live by the law of sin and death? Or are we going to live by the law of the Spirit, which gives us life through the way that Christ made? I want to let you know that God so dearly loves you. You know, whether Paul talks about the law of sin and death, and the law of the Spirit as plan A, plan B, or however you want to think about it, one thing that we should start to understand is the love of God, who constantly is after his people, you and myself, who is constantly trying to bring us back into relationship with him and with neighbor. And that's good news for us. So God dearly, so intimately wants to be with you, wants to love you, and wants to be in this relationship. And that's the good news. And the good news is further played out by the fact that Christ came to make that possible in our lives. That which was impossible on our own is now possible by the steps that we take, by walking according to the Spirit, by walking in the way of the Spirit, in the law of the Spirit. Law sometimes does not connote freedom, but in this case, when Paul talks about the law of the Spirit, he's talking also about the freedom that we find in the Spirit. And so really, we need to get our feet wet. Dip our feet into the river of God, to go with God's flow. And the question here is, how do we go with God's flow? And I want to talk about two things. First, we need to set our minds on the Spirit and not on the flesh. Verses 5 through 6 reads like this: For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. What is the major theme? It's underlined for you. Set the minds, right? Set your minds on the ways of the Spirit. And another way to think about this is that it is not just a matter of the heart. A lot of us think that faith and other things in life are just a matter of the heart. That if your heart is in the right place, then all shall be fine. And I think your heart does need to be in the right place. But you'll notice the passage keeps on emphasizing this idea of your mind being set in the right place, in the Spirit. So that you make a choice. Setting your heart on something is not always good enough without your mind accompanying this. And we see this playing out all the time. Okay, tomorrow's Valentine's Day, obviously. If you're married or have a significant other, remember, tomorrow's Valentine's Day. In marriage, you will know, I don't know because I'm not married, but you will know from my story, the stories I've been hearing, that it's not just a matter of the heart. Valentine's Day we say, oh, it's the heart, it's the heart. But it's not marriage, a good marriage is not just a matter of the heart. But it is also a matter of the mind, where you choose every day to love the person that is next to you, right? Don't you have to choose all the time that you are going to love that person? Because the fact of the matter is that our hearts fail sometimes. It doesn't even have to be in marriage relationships, whether it's a dating relationship or just a friendship. Sometimes our hearts fail. Sometimes our hearts want to say, oh, I hate that person. Dang, I'm so annoyed with that person. But our minds need to come to play and start saying, okay, but I've also decided to love that person. So Paul lifts this idea up that we need to set our minds on the Spirit. It's not just a matter of the heart, but heart needs to be accompanied by the mind so that we can choose, our whole self can choose to be in the Spirit, to set everything on the Spirit. And just in case we think we can't do it, in verse 9, Paul reminded, which was not part of our passage, verse 9, Paul reminds us that, but you are not in the flesh. You are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Just in case we think that we can't make that decision, just in case we think that we're not good enough, Paul reminds us that we are in the Spirit, that the Spirit of God dwells in us, and so we can set our minds on the Spirit, that we need to make that choice in life. And one of the things that we have to think about is, where do you need to make a shift in your mind so that your mind is set on the ways of the Spirit? Think about that. Where in your relationships with God, where in your relationships with your spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, children, co-workers, fellow students, colleagues, whatever, do you need to set your mind on the ways of the Spirit? Where in your life, in regards to your job, in regards to this church, in regards to anything that you're involved in, do you have to set your mind on the Spirit, on the ways of the Spirit? It's a challenge for us. And Paul is calling us to set our minds on the Spirit, not on the ways of the flesh. The second thing, how do we go with God's flow? We need to surrender. And the question is, what is surrender? Ortberg writes this in the book. He says, surrender is the glad and voluntary acknowledgement that there is a God and it is not me. So here's the question. How is surrender glad and voluntary? We never use surrender in the context of glad. Oh, I'm happy to surrender. And voluntary. Usually surrender is a kind of a resigning to the fact that you're defeated. Right? It's not usually voluntary, and it usually is not glad. But Ortberg talks about it in the context of gladness and of choice. Surrender is a glad and voluntary act. Because when you surrender, what you're doing is you're saying, I trust that God really does have my best interest in mind. And we begin to give up, trying to control the outcomes of life. Surrender can be a glad and joyful thing when we actually trust that God has our best interest in mind. When we don't surrender to God, and when it's really hard for us to surrender to God, at least for me, it's a reminder that there is a part of me that doesn't trust that God has my best interest in mind. That God is not powerful in my life. Do you ever experience that? I mean, we can say, I'm not going to surrender. But if you really think about it, there's an element, there's a kind of an undertone of mistrust. Not trusting in God. So surrender may be a glad, maybe a voluntary thing, and could even be glad, but it's not always comfortable. Surrender is not always comfortable, and that's why it's an act of faith. That whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable, whether, we still struggle, surrender is an act of faith because we trust God, that God has our best interest in mind. Years ago, I went whitewater rafting. When I was living in Princeton, going to seminary, my friends and I decided that we would go whitewater rafting in West Virginia. So we packed up the van, drove down to West Virginia. My personality type is this. Risk assessment, right? Don't swim very well. We're going to class 3 or 5 rapids, which means